In 2018, the US and China found themselves in the middle of a heated trade war. It all started when President Donald Trump decided to impose heavy tariffs on Chinese goods, aiming to lower the US trade deficit with China and force the country to make changes in how it does business globally. Tariffs are taxes that are added to imported goods, making them more expensive. In this case, Trump slapped tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese products, ranging from electronics to steel. The idea was simple. By making Chinese products more expensive, American companies and consumers would start buying more US-made goods. But China didn't take it sitting down. Almost immediately, China responded by putting tariffs on US products like soybeans, cars, and machinery. It was a tit-for-tat game where both countries were raising the stakes. As the months passed, the tension kept growing. The two largest economies in the world were on opposite sides of a battle that wasn't just about money but also about power and influence. Companies on both sides began feeling the pressure. American farmers were hurt by China's tariffs on crops like soybeans, while US tech companies were facing challenges due to increased costs on parts from China. The trade war was more than just a series of price hikes. It led to instability in global markets. Stock prices went up and down, and investors were uncertain about what the future would hold. This instability was bad for businesses everywhere, and everyone started to wonder how much longer this back and forth could go on. At the same time, there was a lot of chatter in Washington, D.C. People were questioning whether this trade war would end with a clear winner or if it would drag on, harming both sides. China was angry, not only about the tariffs but also about what they saw as unfair treatment from the U.S. They felt like the U.S. was trying to stop their rise as a global superpower. Behind the scenes, both governments were trying to figure out what their next steps would be. On the surface, it looked like things were calming down at times, but the reality was that both sides were getting more and more determined to win. As 2019 rolled around, it became clear that this trade war wasn't going to end anytime soon. Talks between the U.S. and China continued, but no one was really sure what would happen next. Then, a bold decision by China would stun the world, something that no one expected. But before that, there was one thing that everyone agreed on. This trade war was changing everything. By the time 2019 rolled around, it was clear that neither side was willing to back down. The tariffs kept stacking up, and each time one country imposed new ones, the other responded in kind. While the trade war was mostly talked about in terms of taxes on goods, what no one realized at the time was that China was quietly planning something bigger, something that would catch the U.S. completely off guard. In early 2020, whispers began to spread in Washington about something strange. While trade talks seemed to stall, there were reports that China was working on a response that would go beyond just raising tariffs. Officials in the U.S. government started to get nervous. China, known for its long-term planning and strategic thinking, had been holding back on its strongest cards. But now, it seemed ready to play them. The first hint came when China suddenly stopped buying certain American goods altogether. It wasn't a small gesture, it was a direct hit on key U.S. industries like agriculture, technology, and even energy. The U.S. had always thought that China depended on American technology and resources. But now, China was showing that it could live without these imports. This move stunned the American economy. In Washington, there was confusion and disbelief. How could China do this? U.S. officials had assumed that China would keep playing by the rules of the trade war, exchanging tariffs and putting pressure on industries. But what China did next wasn't just a response. It was a game changer. They targeted sectors that were seen as essential to the U.S. economy, things like rare earth metals and advanced technology components, which were crucial for everything from smartphones to military equipment. At the same time, China was ramping up its rhetoric. Public statements from Beijing were becoming bolder. The Chinese government made it clear that they weren't just angry about the tariffs. They were also tired of being treated unfairly on the global stage. They accused the U.S. of trying to block China's rise as a world power. Behind closed doors, the Chinese leadership had already decided they would strike back in ways the U.S. wasn't prepared for. The American response was immediate, but it was clear that Washington wasn't ready for the magnitude of China's move. While officials tried to spin the situation, It was becoming increasingly difficult to hide the fact that the U.S. was caught off guard. Businesses in the U.S. began to feel the pain. Companies that depended on Chinese exports saw their costs rise dramatically, and some were forced to rethink their supply chains altogether. Major tech companies like Apple, Intel, and others were directly impacted. China's message was clear. It wasn't just going to take the punches anymore. As the situation began to escalate, many experts in Washington started to panic. Some argued that the U.S. had underestimated China's patience and its ability to make bold moves. The White House began to look for ways to respond, but they were uncertain about how to counteract China's new strategy. The once clear-cut idea of tariffs and trade barriers didn't seem enough anymore. The balance had shifted. Inside China, however, officials weren't just reacting. They were thinking 2 steps ahead. They knew that this move would create chaos in the U.S. But that was the point. China wasn't just interested in hurting the U.S. economy. It wanted to shift the global power balance in its favor. And this bold move, although initially shocking, was just the beginning. It wasn't long before the world began to realize that the trade war was no longer just about tariffs. It was about something much bigger, the future of global power. And the next few months would prove to be a defining moment for both China and the United States. As news spread about China's bold move, shockwaves rippled through the global economy. The effects weren't just felt in Washington, D.C., but across the entire world. Financial markets that had already been on edge due to the ongoing trade war suddenly took a nosedive. Stock prices dropped sharply, and investors around the globe rushed to pull their money out of markets they feared were about to spiral out of control. The biggest impact was felt on Wall Street. The U.S. stock market, which had been riding high on hopes of a trade deal between the two nations, suddenly plunged. Major indexes like the Dow Jones, S&P 500, and Nasdaq all took massive hits. The panic wasn't just about tariffs. It was about the unknown. What China had done wasn't just a financial move. It was a signal that the trade war was entering a new and dangerous phase. If this wasn't handled carefully, it could trigger a global recession. Across the U.S., business owners and industry leaders began to panic. Companies that had heavily relied on Chinese imports, especially in tech and manufacturing, found themselves in a difficult position. The cost of goods skyrocketed, and many companies faced the harsh reality of either increasing prices on their products or cutting back on production. But cutting back wasn't always an option. In industries like electronics, where China provided essential components, companies like Apple, Dell, and Microsoft found themselves scrambling to find new suppliers. Farmers in the U.S. were some of the hardest hit. China had been one of the biggest buyers of U.S. agricultural products, especially soybeans. But with China halting its purchases, many American farmers were left without a market for their goods. The price of soybeans, corn, and wheat took a massive tumble. In rural areas across the U.S., farmers were facing a grim future. The U.S. government tried to step in, offering financial aid to affected farmers, but it was clear that the damage had already been done. China's decision to target these key industries wasn't just a hit to the economy. It was a direct attack on parts of America's heartland. But the chaos wasn't limited to just the U.S. Other countries, especially those in Europe and Asia, felt the ripple effects as well. In countries that relied on trade with both the U.S. and China, like Germany, Japan, and South Korea, the situation became increasingly complicated. These nations found themselves caught in the crossfire. On one hand, they had strong trade relationships with the U.S. On the other, they needed to maintain good ties with China, which was becoming a dominant player in global trade. As the trade war dragged on, many nations began to reassess their position, wondering which side they should really back in this global clash. In Beijing, Chinese officials were watching with a sense of calculated satisfaction. Their strategy was working. The bold move had rattled the U.S. economy and disrupted the global order. But they were far from finished. Behind the scenes, China was carefully calculating its next steps. The leadership knew that the U.S. had always seen itself as the dominant global power. But China's decision to strike back in such a bold way was meant to send a message. China was no longer going to play second fiddle. It had the power to change the game. The U.S. government was reeling from the fallout. At first, President Trump's administration tried to downplay the situation, calling it a temporary setback. But soon, it became clear that China wasn't going to back down. Senior officials began to scramble, trying to find a way to deal with the unexpected crisis. There were emergency meetings at the White House, and top economic advisors tried to come up with a strategy to mitigate the damage. But every option seemed to have its own set of risks, and time was running out. Diplomatic talks between the two nations became tense and even hostile. The U.S. sent high-level delegations to Beijing, hoping to negotiate some sort of truce. But the Chinese government, sensing an opportunity to push its advantage, played hardball. They demanded more concessions from the U.S. and refused to back down until the Trump administration agreed to revise the trade terms that had led to the tariffs in the first place. The American negotiating team was caught off guard by China's demands, which were far more aggressive than anyone had anticipated. At the same time, the U.S. public was growing anxious. News outlets across the country were filled with stories of job losses, rising costs, and businesses struggling to stay afloat. The political pressure on the White House intensified. Some Republicans, who had initially supported the tariffs, began to distance themselves from the administration, worried about the impact the trade war was having on their constituents. Meanwhile, Democrats were criticizing the administration for not doing enough to protect American workers from the fallout. Across the globe, businesses in other countries were also struggling to cope with the fallout. Global supply chains were already fragile, and now, with China's bold move, many industries were facing major disruptions. Tech companies in Europe and Asia, which relied on Chinese-manufactured components, suddenly found themselves with limited access to the materials they needed. Manufacturers in Africa and Latin America, who exported goods to both the U.S. and China, saw their markets dry up as the two largest economies in the world fought it out. In the midst of all this chaos, no one really knew what was coming next. The world had never seen anything like this before. The trade war was no longer just a matter of tariffs. It had become a global struggle for dominance. And at the center of it all, China was emerging as a formidable power that was determined to change the rules of the game. For many, the question was no longer about how the trade war would end, but what kind of world would emerge on the other side. Would the U.S. remain the global leader, or was this the beginning of a new era where China called the shots? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: the world was never going to be the same. The aftermath of China's bold move rippled across the globe, and it became clear that this wasn't just a two-nation issue anymore. Other countries, economies, and international organizations began to take stock of the situation and wonder what their position should be in the unfolding economic clash between the U.S. and China. The trade war wasn't simply a fight over tariffs and trade balance anymore. It had evolved into a larger geopolitical struggle for global dominance. America's allies found themselves in a difficult position. The European Union, Japan, Australia, and others had strong economic ties to both China and the U.S. No one wanted to pick sides, but the actions of China left many countries with little choice but to consider their next move carefully. The European Union, for instance, had always been aligned with the U.S. on many global issues. But now, with the U.S. deeply engaged in a trade war with China, the EU had to carefully reconsider its own strategy. European manufacturers and tech companies had deep ties to China, and the idea of alienating such an important trading partner was risky. At the same time, they couldn't completely ignore the U.S. The EU found itself caught in the middle, trying to maintain relations with both powers while also calling for de-escalation. European leaders began urging both sides to return to the negotiating table, warning of the severe consequences of continued conflict. In Asia, Japan and South Korea, two of the U.S.'s strongest allies, were similarly caught between loyalty to Washington and the need to maintain their economic relationship with China. Japan, with its high-tech manufacturing industry, found itself in a tough spot. Much of its supply chain was tied to China, from raw materials to finished products. South Korea, too, found itself in a tricky situation. With its tech giants like Samsung relying on Chinese manufacturing, it couldn't afford to take sides. Both countries were pushing for diplomacy, but the pressure was mounting as China's bold actions threw the region into uncertainty. Australia, a staunch U.S. ally, was facing its own dilemma. The country had been increasingly economically tied to China, especially in areas like mining and agriculture. With Beijing now acting so decisively, Australia needed to tread carefully. While it stood by the US in terms of geopolitical concerns, especially when it came to security issues, Australia's economy was heavily reliant on Chinese demand for raw materials. Australia's response was largely diplomatic, urging both sides to engage in dialogue while trying to protect its own interests in the process. Beyond the traditional allies of the US, emerging markets and other countries around the world were also feeling the heat. Nations in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, which had built strong trade relationships with both powers, began questioning the long-term sustainability of these relationships. In Latin America, countries like Brazil and Mexico, which exported agricultural goods to China, were hit by the collapse of trade deals. They have been forced to reconsider their export strategies as China shifted away from American products. In Africa, many nations that had long depended on China's investments in infrastructure were now unsure how to proceed. Would they stand by the US and risk damaging trade deals with China? Or would they prioritize their growing ties with China, the world's second-largest economy? The global economic uncertainty wasn't just about the immediate tariffs and trade barriers. It was about the long-term implications for these countries' economic futures. These nations were quickly realizing that a prolonged conflict between the US and China could disrupt their own growth and progress. While diplomatic and economic leaders tried to figure out how to respond, the media in both China and the US was in overdrive. The narrative was being shaped by powerful news outlets in both countries, each framing the situation in their own way. In China, state-run media spun the story as a victory for Chinese strength and resilience. The bold move was portrayed as a necessary step to protect China's sovereignty and economic interests. The Chinese government pushed the idea that they had been unfairly treated by the US for years, and this was the moment when China would no longer sit idly by while its future was dictated by Washington. The message to the Chinese people was clear. China would not back down in the face of US pressure. Instead, it was ready to stand up and assert its rightful place as a global power. In the US, the media's reaction was mixed. Conservative outlets tended to support Trump's tough stance against China, even as the fallout from China's response grew more intense. However, even many on the right were beginning to worry about the long-term damage to the economy. On the other hand, liberal and moderate media outlets were quick to criticize the administration's handling of the situation. They painted the trade war as a reckless gamble that was hurting American workers and companies. Social media, too, became a battleground for public opinion. On Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms, people from both countries exchanged heated opinions. American businesses, particularly in tech, were pushing back against the tariffs, warning that they would raise prices and slow down innovation. Meanwhile, Chinese citizens used social media to voice their support for their government's bold actions, calling for greater independence from the West. The rhetoric on both sides grew increasingly charged, with nationalist sentiments rising in both countries. As the world watched this war of words unfold, it became clear that this wasn't just a trade issue anymore. It was also about pride, power, and global influence. Back in the US, the effects of China's retaliation were being felt in full force. Key industries were struggling to keep up with the rapidly changing market conditions. Tech companies, which had been some of the most vocal supporters of Trump's tariffs, were now crying foul. The rising costs of Chinese components were hitting their bottom lines hard. Apple, for example, was facing massive production delays as the cost of its Chinese-manufactured components surged. Other companies that relied on Chinese manufacturing and materials were facing similar challenges. The automotive industry, which had been already facing challenges due to rising labor costs and shifting consumer demand, was now hit by the tariffs. American car manufacturers that relied on Chinese-made parts or raw materials were struggling with increased production costs. Even the cost of raw materials like steel and aluminum, which were essential for manufacturing everything from cars to appliances, was soaring. The broader American public, too, began to feel the pressure. Prices were rising across the board. Consumers were seeing the costs of everyday goods climb as the trade war continued. While some believed it was all part of a necessary reset, Others began to question whether the economic pain was worth the political and economic gains. Politicians in Washington were increasingly divided. While some continued to stand by Trump's tough approach, many others, especially those from swing states that had been hit hardest by the economic fallout, began to speak out. The pain in places like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania was real, and the U.S. government faced mounting pressure to find a solution to the conflict. As things continued to spiral, it became clear that China's bold retaliation had changed everything. The U.S. was no longer in control of the situation, and the global economic order had been shifted. What had started as a trade dispute had now become a high-stakes battle for the future of global power, and no one could say for certain what the outcome would be. As the full scale of China's bold actions against the U.S. sank in, the world began to grasp that the consequences were not just temporary bumps in the road. This was a watershed moment. The repercussions would be felt not just in the immediate aftermath, but for years to come. For the United States, the economic damage was already visible, but the political and diplomatic fallout was only beginning to unfold. The long-term effects would be far-reaching, not only in terms of trade but also in reshaping the global balance of power. The immediate impact of China's countermeasure was most visible in the American economy. Industries that had been directly reliant on Chinese imports or exports were hit the hardest. The most obvious example was the tech sector, where companies like Apple, Intel, and Dell found themselves in a difficult position. They had already been coping with the rising costs of components from China due to the tariffs. But with China's retaliatory moves, things escalated quickly. Production delays became more common, and costs for raw materials spiked. For many companies, there was no easy solution. Some moved to shift production out of China, but this was easier said than done. The logistical challenges and increased costs associated with moving production lines elsewhere were enormous. Tech giants like Apple found themselves at a crossroads. To avoid higher prices and supply chain disruptions, they needed to find new manufacturing partners outside China. This was a huge undertaking, and while companies like Apple and other tech firms were looking at alternative countries in Southeast Asia, the fact remained that no other country could match China's scale and efficiency in manufacturing. The result? Higher prices for consumers. While companies tried to absorb some of the costs, it was inevitable that the burden would eventually fall on the American public. Another industry hard hit by China's response was agriculture. American farmers, especially those in the Midwest, had been exporting massive quantities of crops like soybeans, corn, and wheat to China. But with China halting these imports, the U.S. agricultural industry was left reeling. Farmers who had relied on Chinese markets for their products faced a grim future. Soybean prices dropped sharply, and many farmers were left with no way to sell their crops. This put pressure on rural communities, where farming was often the backbone of the local economy. The U.S. government stepped in with financial aid packages, offering subsidies to struggling farmers, but it became clear that these measures were only temporary solutions. The long-term damage to the agricultural sector would take years to repair. On the broader scale, American businesses saw their costs rise across the board. Inflationary pressures grew, with everything from electronics to everyday household items becoming more expensive. Middle-class families, already feeling the strain of stagnant wages and rising living costs, were hit hardest. It was becoming clear that the trade war was not a simple matter of negotiating tariffs. It was reshaping the American economy in profound ways. The political fallout was equally intense. As the economic consequences began to sink in, the pressure on President Trump and his administration grew. For months, Trump had portrayed the trade war as a necessary step in resetting America's relationship with China. His administration had argued that the tariffs were meant to bring fairness back to the trade system, with the goal of reducing the trade deficit and pushing China to play by the rules. But as the economic impact of China's retaliatory measures became undeniable, cracks began to appear in the administration's narrative. Republican lawmakers, particularly those from districts and states that had been hardest hit by the trade war, started to publicly question Trump's strategy. The support for the tariff started to waver. In the Senate and House, some Republicans who had once supported the tough stance on China were now worried about re-election and the impact the tariffs were having on their constituents. It wasn't just Republicans who were feeling the heat. Democrats, who had long criticized Trump's approach to foreign policy, were quick to point out that the trade war had harmed American workers and companies. The 2020 presidential election was looming, and the trade war was already becoming a key issue. Democratic candidates seized on the economic pain caused by the tariffs, arguing that Trump's approach had failed to deliver the promised results. As the pressure mounted, the White House began to search for ways to end the trade war. Talks between the U.S. and China, which had stalled months before, resumed behind closed doors. But the negotiations weren't going well. China, emboldened by its successful retaliation, was demanding far more from the U.S. than before. The Trump administration was finding it increasingly difficult to balance the pressure from both domestic businesses and foreign policy hawks who wanted to continue the tough stance on China. The diplomatic fallout was also significant. Countries that had once been U.S. allies were now rethinking their own positions. Some, like the European Union and Japan, urged both the U.S. and China to resolve the conflict. Others, like Russia, saw an opportunity to push their own agenda in the wake of the trade war. For Russia, the situation was one of opportunity. With both the U.S. and China focused on their own issues, Russia could assert itself more in international forums and expand its influence in Europe and Asia. China, on the other hand, was increasingly seen as the leader of a new global economic order. Its bold move against the U.S. sent a message to the world. China was no longer going to play second fiddle to the U.S. The global power dynamic was shifting, and China was at the center of that shift. Many countries began to reconsider their alliances and trade relationships in light of China's growing influence. Countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which had previously relied heavily on the U.S., began to look to China as a more reliable partner. For China, the decision to retaliate so boldly was part of a larger, long-term strategy to reshape the global balance of power. While the U.S. had always viewed itself as the dominant superpower, China was making it clear that it was ready to challenge that position. China had spent decades building its economy, investing heavily in technology, infrastructure, and manufacturing. Its leadership had always envisioned a world where China played a more central role, not just in global trade, but in shaping international institutions. The trade war, and China's response, was part of this broader vision. By striking back against the U.S. so decisively, China was signaling to the world that it would no longer accept being treated as an economic underdog. China's ultimate goal was not just to become a superpower in terms of economic size. It wanted to control the global economic system. The country had already made massive strides in sectors like telecommunications and artificial intelligence, and its Belt and Road Initiative, which sought to build infrastructure and foster trade with countries across Asia, Africa, and Europe, was a clear example of China's ambitions to expand its global influence. The trade war, and China's strategic response, was an attempt to accelerate this process. By inflicting economic pain on the U.S., China was weakening its global dominance and positioning itself as the leader of a new global economic order. Whether the world was ready for this shift was another question, but one thing was certain: China had made its move. Looking at the bigger picture, the events of the trade war were just a preview of the larger geopolitical struggle that was unfolding. The future of global power was being written in real time, and it was no longer clear who would come out on top. Would the U.S. manage to regain control, or would China successfully carve out a new role for itself on the world stage? The global order that had been dominated by the U.S. for decades was now being challenged. Nations that had once relied on U.S. leadership were now exploring new alliances, trying to figure out where they fit in this new world. As the trade war dragged on, the global community began to ask itself one question: what kind of world would emerge on the other side? For the U.S., it was clear that the path forward wouldn't be easy. The old rules of engagement were gone, and a new era of global politics had arrived. The U.S. and China were now locked in a struggle not just over trade, but for the future of global power. And as the dust settled, one thing was clear: the world would never be the same again. Both sides realized that they could not afford to continue down the path of confrontation. The question was no longer about winning the trade war. It was about how to reset the relationship to ensure mutual stability and economic growth. After months of intense negotiations, The US and China announced a framework for a new trade agreement in early 2021. The deal was not a complete victory for either side, but rather a compromise that sought to address some of the key issues without further escalating the conflict. Both countries agreed to reduce some tariffs, increase cooperation in specific sectors like technology and agriculture, and work toward reforming the global trade system to make it more equitable. However, the deal was only a first step toward rebuilding the fractured relationship between the two nations. Many issues remained unresolved, and both sides knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The global economy was still fragile, and many countries were still dealing with the fallout from the trade war. The diplomatic thaw between the US and China did not immediately resolve all the underlying issues, especially concerns over intellectual property theft, market access, and the future of global supply chains. Still, for the moment, there was a glimmer of hope. The world had avoided further escalation, and the first steps toward a new economic order had been taken. But whether the fragile peace would hold or whether new tensions would arise remained to be seen. One thing was clear: the world had changed, and the global balance of power had shifted in ways that no one could have predicted just a few years earlier. The future of US-China relations, and indeed the future of the global economy, would be shaped by the lessons learned during the trade war and the decisions made in its aftermath. The resolution between the US and China marked a pivotal moment in modern history, but the ripple effects of the trade war would continue to shape the global landscape for years to come. The aftermath of the dispute was not just a bilateral issue between two powerful countries. It had transformed the way the world viewed global trade, international relations, and economic power dynamics. One of the most significant long-term consequences of the US-China trade war was the reshaping of global economic alliances. As both countries tried to recover from the damage, the power vacuum created by the instability forced smaller nations to reconsider their strategic alliances. Nations that had traditionally relied on the US as a cornerstone of their economic and diplomatic policies began to hedge their bets and seek out alternatives, with China positioning itself as a more attractive partner for trade and investment. For instance, many Southeast Asian nations, which had previously been more aligned with the US, began to deepen their economic ties with China. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand began exploring opportunities in China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which offered massive infrastructure projects and favorable trade deals. The BRI, which had been a key part of China's foreign policy, had already made significant inroads in regions like Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Now, with the US and China embroiled in their trade war, it became clear that China was willing to leverage its economic muscle in a way the US had not. Meanwhile, Europe, while maintaining its strong economic ties with the US, began to explore a more independent course. The European Union became more vocal in advocating for multilateralism, urging both the US and China to engage in reforms to the global trade system. Europe's growing emphasis on sustainability, green technologies, and digital economies provided a platform for new trade agreements that could redefine its role in the global economy. In the long run, Europe's economic future seemed to lie in diversification and cooperation with emerging markets, particularly those in Asia and Africa. Japan, South Korea, and Australia also found themselves recalibrating their foreign policies. Japan, with its focus on technological innovation, sought to increase its influence in Asia while still maintaining strong ties with the US. South Korea, caught between its alliance with the US and its dependence on China, played a delicate balancing act, seeking to position itself as a neutral player in the evolving trade order. For China, the trade war was not merely a series of negotiations over tariffs. It was an opportunity to expand its role as a leader of the global economic order. While the US had been caught in a cycle of trade protectionism and isolationist rhetoric under the Trump administration, China had positioned itself as a champion of globalization. This shift was particularly apparent in China's handling of international trade agreements during and after the conflict. China's position in the World Trade Organization, WTO, grew stronger as it worked to build new trade networks and alliances. Many countries that had previously been hesitant to align too closely with China due to its human rights record or authoritarian political system began to reconsider as China's economic power grew. For countries in need of infrastructure development, access to China's vast markets, or technology transfers, the potential benefits of closer ties to Beijing became hard to ignore. One of the cornerstones of China's post-trade war strategy was its push for more control over the digital economy. China's technological advancements in areas like artificial intelligence, 5G, and e-commerce had made it a dominant force in the digital realm. By 2025, China had emerged as the undisputed leader in the global digital economy, with Chinese tech companies like Huawei, Tencent, and Alibaba influencing markets across the world. This digital dominance not only boosted China's economic power but also allowed it to set the terms for future trade agreements, particularly in sectors related to technology and innovation. In contrast to the U.S., which struggled to regain its footing after the trade war, China's ability to maintain and expand its role as the world's factory, while also becoming a global leader in cutting-edge industries, solidified its place at the top of the global economic hierarchy. The U.S., despite the eventual agreement with China, would not emerge unscathed from a trade war. While the resolution helped stabilize certain sectors, such as agriculture and manufacturing, the scars left by the prolonged conflict would be visible for years. The trade war had exposed deep vulnerabilities in the U.S. economy, particularly its over-reliance on China for essential goods and components. American manufacturers, for example, faced increased competition from other countries that had taken advantage of China's shifting global position. Countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico, which had benefited from the disruption in China's manufacturing sector, began to capture market share in industries like electronics and textiles. U.S. companies that had once relied on Chinese production were now shifting to these new hubs, and the result was a gradual but significant reshaping of the global supply chain. In addition, the U.S. tech sector faced new challenges. While companies like Apple and Intel had successfully diversified their supply chains to other Asian countries, the trade war had highlighted the dangers of overdependence on a single country or region for key components. In the years following the trade war, the U.S. tech sector doubled down on reshoring efforts, but the effort to bring manufacturing jobs back home was slow, costly, and fraught with logistical challenges. While automation and innovation helped fill some of the gaps, it was clear that the U.S. had lost its competitive edge in key sectors like low-cost manufacturing. The rise of China's digital economy also forced the U.S. to rethink its approach to technology. China's rapid advancements in 5G networks, cloud computing, and AI presented a challenge to American dominance in these fields. The U.S. government responded with a renewed focus on innovation, investing heavily in technology and research. Yet, it was apparent that China's ability to control vast markets and integrate new technologies into its economy was giving it a significant advantage in the digital age. The broader global trade environment saw significant changes as well. The trade war had exposed the flaws in the existing global trading system. The WTO, which had served as the central institution for global trade, was widely criticized for its inability to prevent or resolve conflicts between major powers like the U.S. and China. Both countries had bypassed the WTO during the trade war, opting for bilateral negotiations that sidelined the international body. In the wake of the trade war, there were growing calls for reforming global trade institutions. Many countries, especially those in the developing world, began to demand a more equitable and transparent system that would provide them with greater access to global markets. The shift toward regional trade agreements, such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCP, reflected the desire to create a more decentralized and flexible system for global trade. The rise of digital trade also complicated matters. As e-commerce became a dominant force in the global economy, new rules and regulations were needed to govern cross-border data flows, privacy concerns, and digital taxation. China, with its leadership in the digital economy, was already setting the agenda for these new global trade norms, and the U.S. was forced to adapt. The trade war also forced a rethinking of geopolitics, especially in terms of security. The U.S.-China rivalry, which had previously been framed primarily in economic terms, became more overtly strategic. Both countries increased their military presence in the Asia-Pacific region, and tensions in the South China Sea reached new highs. The U.S. began strengthening its alliances with countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia to counter China's growing influence in the region. For China, the trade war had reaffirmed the importance of securing its interests in the South China Sea and other contested regions. With the U.S. distracted by internal political battles and the fallout from the trade war, China seized opportunities to expand its influence in key maritime routes, signaling its intentions to secure access to global trade corridors. Simultaneously, countries in the global south, which had been largely overlooked in previous global power dynamics, began to assert their influence. African nations, Latin America, and Southeast Asia were increasingly seen as crucial battlegrounds for influence between the U.S. and China. The trade war had made it clear that power in the 21st century would be defined not just by military might or economic size, but by the ability to forge strategic relationships and alliances. Looking ahead, the trade war between the U.S. and China had proven to be a defining moment in the history of global politics. It had reshaped the global economic order, realigned international alliances, and sparked a new era of geopolitical competition. The U.S. and China, once seemingly locked in a singular rivalry, were now part of a broader global struggle for power, influence, and control of the future. Though the trade war officially ended with an agreement, its effects were far from over. The global economy was in flux, new power centers were emerging, and the rules of engagement were being rewritten. The world, now more interconnected than ever, would face new challenges and opportunities as it navigated the aftermath of one of the most consequential trade conflicts in modern history.